I knew something had changed the moment I heard them laugh and realized it wasn't meant for me. It was a quiet kind of laughter, the kind that settles into the walls of a house and lingers there, warm and familiar. I was standing in the hallway just outside the dining room, my hand resting lightly against the doorframe. I hadn't meant to stop. I had only been passing through on my way to the kitchen, but then I heard my son's voice. Low, relaxed. Comfortable in a way I hadn't heard in weeks, and then my daughter's laughter followed. Light, quick, almost breathless. For a moment I smiled. It had been so long since the house sounded like that. So long since everyone had been together at the same table without tension sitting between us like an uninvited guest. I took a step forward, ready to walk in, and then I noticed something small. Something so small it shouldn't have mattered. The door was almost closed, not fully. Just enough that I had to push it open to enter. We never closed that door, not in all the years we had lived in that house. Dinner had always been open, no barriers, no quiet exclusions. I stood there longer than I should have, just listening. Someone said something I couldn't quite make out, then more laughter followed, softer this time, controlled, as if they didn't want it to carry too far. That was the moment I felt it, not anger, not even sadness, just a shift. Like standing in a room that used to belong to you and realizing the furniture had been rearranged while you weren't looking. I pushed the door open anyway. The laughter stopped almost instantly. 3 faces turned toward me. My son Damien was sitting at the head of the table, his hand still wrapped loosely around a glass of water. My daughter Melissa sat to his left, her shoulders slightly raised as if she had been caught mid-reaction. And across from them, quietly folding her napkin, was Genevieve, Damien's wife. No one said anything for a second. It wasn't a long silence, but it was long enough. I didn't know we were having dinner already, I said, keeping my voice even. Damien cleared his throat. It was just something quick, Mom. We didn't think you were hungry yet. I nodded slowly, though I couldn't remember the last time I had ever skipped dinner. Oh, I said, I must have missed it. Melissa looked down at her plate. Genevieve gave a small, polite smile, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes. There's still food in the kitchen, she added gently. Of course there always was, but that wasn't the point. I stood there for another second, waiting for something, an invitation, a gesture. Even a chair being pulled out. None came, so I smiled, a small, careful smile I had learned to wear over the years. I'll eat later, I said, you all go ahead. And then I stepped back out into the hallway, pulling the door slightly closer than it had been before. Not fully closed, just enough. Before that night, I would have told you we were a close family, not perfect, never perfect, but close in the ways that matter. Sunday mornings always started the same way. I would wake up early, long before the others, and make coffee. The smell would fill the house slowly, weaving its way into each room until someone eventually wandered into the kitchen, drawn by it. Damien was usually the first. Even as a grown man, he still walked into the kitchen the same way he had as a boy. Quiet steps, slightly hunched shoulders, hair not quite in place. Morning, Mom, he would mumble, reaching for a mug before he was fully awake. Morning, I'd reply, sliding the sugar closer to him without asking. It was a small thing, but it was ours. Melissa came later, always with more energy, more noise. She'd talk as soon as she entered the room, picking up conversations that hadn't even started yet. And Genevieve was different. She was polite, thoughtful, careful with her words. When Damien first brought her home, I remember thinking how composed she was, how she seemed to observe everything before speaking, as if measuring each moment. At the time, I admired that about her. I thought it meant she respected the space she was entering, and for a while things were easy, not perfect like I said, but steady. We ate dinner together most nights. Not always at the same time, not always with the same energy, but together enough that it felt like a rhythm. A shared understanding. If someone was late, they'd call. If someone couldn't make it, they'd explain. There were no surprises, no quiet doors. No laughter that stopped when someone entered the room, but looking back now, I can see it. The change didn't happen all at once. It never does. It starts with small things, things you almost ignore, like the way Genevieve began suggesting that dinner be a little earlier some nights. Or how Damien started eating before I got home from the store, saying he didn't want the food to get cold. Melissa began spending more time in Genevieve's company, the two of them talking in low voices that trailed off when I walked in. At first, I told myself it was natural. People grow closer, families shift. That's what happens when children become adults, when new people enter the home. You make space, you adjust, you don't hold on too tightly. I understood all of that. I told myself I did. But there were moments, small, quiet moments that stayed with me longer than they should have. Like the afternoon, I walked into the living room and found the three of them sitting together, looking at something on Genevieve's phone. They were leaning in close, their shoulders nearly touching. When I asked what it was, Damien looked up too quickly. "Just something work-related," he said. Melissa nodded but didn't meet my eyes. Genevieve smiled, that same careful, measured smile. "It's nothing important," she added, and maybe it was. But the way they closed in on themselves, the way the space seemed to shift when I entered, it left something behind. Something I couldn't quite name, so I ignored it. Because sometimes ignoring things feels easier than naming them. Easier than asking questions you're not ready to hear the answers to. But that night, the night they sat together without me, something settled into place. Not all at once, but enough. I went into the kitchen and stood there for a while, staring at the pot on the stove. There was food inside, still warm. They hadn't forgotten to cook. They had just forgotten me, or maybe they hadn't forgotten at all. Maybe they had remembered. And chosen not to call me in. I reached for a plate, then stopped. My hands felt heavier than they should have. Instead, I turned off the stove, covered the pot, and walked back to my room. As I passed the dining room again, I heard their voices, quieter now. Careful, as if the house itself had learned to keep secrets. I didn't stop this time, I just kept walking. And somewhere between the hallway and my bedroom door, a thought crossed my mind. Not loud, not dramatic, just clear. I was still living in the same house. But I was no longer part of the same room, and I didn't yet know why or how long it had been that way. I only knew one thing: that night wasn't the beginning. It was just the first time I had allowed myself to see it. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had slept well, but because something inside me refused to stay still. The house was quiet, too quiet for a Sunday. For years, Sundays had carried a certain softness, a slow unfolding of sound. The hum of the coffee machine, the creak of the kitchen floor, the quiet rhythm of familiar routines brushing against each other. But that morning there was nothing, no footsteps, no voices, no smell of coffee. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening for something that didn't come. Then I got up. I wrapped my robe around me and walked down the hallway, each step careful, almost deliberate. As if I didn't want to disturb whatever had replaced the life that used to fill this house. The kitchen was empty, cold, the coffee pot sat untouched. The sink was clean, no cups left out, no crumbs on the counter. It looked like a place no one had used. For a moment I wondered if I had imagined everything. If maybe I had simply woken up too early, but then I noticed it. A small detail, 3 mugs in the drying rack, not 4. I walked closer, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the counter. The mugs were still slightly damp. They had already been here, together, without me. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at something so ordinary it almost felt absurd to give it meaning. But meaning has a way of finding you, even in the smallest things. Especially in the smallest things. I made my coffee anyway, slowly, deliberately, as if following the steps of something that still belonged to me. When the machine began to hum, the sound felt louder than usual. It echoed in the quiet kitchen, filling a space that no longer responded. I poured myself a cup, sat at the table, and waited, not for anyone in particular, just waited. It was something I had always done, even before all this. I would sit with my coffee and let the house wake up around me, but that morning it didn't. Time passed. 5 minutes, 10, 15, still nothing, no doors opening, no footsteps approaching, no voices drifting in from the hallway. Finally, I stood up. Not because I wanted to, but because sitting there any longer felt like holding on to something that had already let go. I walked down the hallway toward Damien's room first. The door was open. The bed was made, no sign that anyone had been there that morning. Then Melissa's room, also empty, and Genevieve, her door was closed. I hesitated just for a moment. Then I knocked lightly, no answer. I knocked again, still nothing. I reached for the handle and turned it slowly. The room was empty, the bed neatly arranged, the air still. They were all gone, without a word, without a sound, without me. By the time they returned that afternoon, I had already cleaned the kitchen twice. Not because it needed it, but because I needed something to do with my hands. Something that didn't require thinking. Something that didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. I heard the front door open. Voices followed. Light, casual, comfortable. The same kind of comfort I had heard the night before. I stayed in the kitchen. I didn't go out to greet them, not immediately. I waited until they had settled in, until their voices had found their places in the house again. Then I stepped into the hallway. Melissa was the first to see me. "Oh, Mom, you're up," she said, as if it were unusual. "I've been up," I replied. She nodded quickly, too quickly. Damien appeared behind her, keys still in his hand. "Hey, Mom," he said. "We went out for breakfast. You were sleeping, so we didn't want to wake you." I looked at him for a moment, really looked, trying to find something familiar in his expression. Something that told me this was still the same son who used to sit at the kitchen table, waiting for me to pour his coffee. "I see," I said quietly. Genevieve stepped forward then, her tone soft, measured. "We thought you might enjoy the rest," she added. "You've seemed a little tired lately." There it was again, that careful kindness, the kind that feels more like distance than care. "I'm not that tired," I replied. A small pause followed, not long, but enough. "Well," Damien said, shifting slightly, "we brought something back for you." "It's in the kitchen," I nodded. "Thank you." But I didn't go to look, not right away. Instead, I stood there for a few more seconds watching them, the way they stood together, not consciously, not deliberately, but close. As if they had found a rhythm that didn't quite include me anymore. And then, just like that, the moment passed. Melissa moved toward her room. Damien followed shortly after. Genevieve lingered for a second. She looked at me, held my gaze, and then offered that same small smile. "If you need anything, just let me know," she said. I nodded again. "I will." But we both knew I wouldn't. Later that evening, I finally opened the container they had left in the kitchen. It was still neatly packed, untouched, a small portion of eggs. A piece of toast, a side of fruit, carefully arranged, considered, thoughtful in its own way, but it didn't feel like something meant for me. It felt like something left behind. I sat down at the table and stared at it for a long time. Until the edges of the toast began to harden, until the fruit lost its shine. And still I didn't take a bite, because hunger wasn't the problem. It was something else, something deeper, something quieter. That night I didn't go to the dining room. Even when I heard them gathering again, even when I heard the soft clinking of plates, the low murmur of conversation, I stayed in my room, sat by the window, and listened to the house breathe without me. It would have been easier to believe it was all in my head, a misunderstanding, a phase, something temporary, but the days that followed didn't offer that comfort. They only made things clearer. Dinner times shifted, without notice, without explanation, sometimes earlier, sometimes later. Always just enough that I seemed to miss them. Conversations grew shorter, more functional, less shared. Melissa stopped telling me about her day. Damien stopped asking about mine. And Genevieve remained exactly the same. Polite, calm, careful, but always just a step away. As if she knew something I didn't, as if she had already accepted a truth I was still trying to understand. One evening, about a week later, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I set the table, all 4 places, carefully, intentionally. I cooked a full meal, something simple but familiar: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, the kind of meal that used to bring everyone to the table without question. I placed the dishes down, adjusted the napkins, checked the time, and then I waited. 6 o'clock passed, then 6:30. Then 7, no one came, no one called, no one even walked into the kitchen to ask. The food sat there, cooling slowly, losing its warmth, losing its purpose. At 7:15, I heard the front door open. Voices followed. Again, laughter, again. I didn't move this time. I stayed at the table, my hands folded neatly in front of me, waiting. Damien walked in first. He stopped when he saw the table. "Oh," he said, just that. "Oh." Melissa stepped in behind him, her expression shifted slightly. "Mom, we already ate." I nodded slowly. "I see." Genevieve entered last, her eyes moved from the table to me, then back again. "You should have told us," she said gently. "We made plans," Damien added quickly. "We thought you knew." I looked at him. I didn't. Another pause. Then Melissa spoke, softer this time. "We can still sit with you if you want." It was meant to be kind, I know it was, but something about it felt misplaced, like an afterthought. "No," I said, "that's all right." I stood up, began clearing the table. One plate at a time. No one stopped me, no one insisted. They just stood there, watching, and then one by one they drifted away, back into their spaces, back into whatever it was they shared now, and I was left in the kitchen with a meal that had no one to belong to. That was the night I stopped telling myself it was nothing. That was the night I allowed the question to form. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. Why, and more importantly, since when? I didn't ask the question out loud. Not yet. Some questions, when spoken too soon, have a way of breaking things before you understand what you're breaking. So instead, I carried it quietly, like something fragile. Like something that might still have a different answer if I handled it carefully enough. The next few days, I paid attention in a way I hadn't before. Not openly, not in a way that would make anyone uncomfortable, but closely, carefully. The way you observe something you're not sure you're supposed to see. It started with the mornings. I adjusted my routine, woke up earlier, moved more quietly. One morning I stood just outside the kitchen, hidden slightly by the edge of the hallway wall, and I waited. At first there was nothing, then I heard it. The soft click of a cabinet opening, the low murmur of voices. I leaned just enough to see. Damien was standing by the counter, pouring coffee. Melissa sat at the table, her phone in her hand, but her attention somewhere else entirely. And Genevieve stood between them, not quite leading, not quite following, but present in a way that seemed to hold the moment together. They were talking, not loudly, not dramatically, but easily, naturally. Damien said something that made Melissa laugh. Genevieve added something after, and Damien smiled in a way I hadn't seen in a while. It wasn't just happiness. It was ease, the kind of ease that comes when you feel understood without needing to explain yourself. I stayed there longer than I should have, long enough to realize something I hadn't wanted to admit. This wasn't new, this wasn't something that had started overnight. This had been building, quietly, patiently, in moments I had overlooked, moments I had been absent from. Or perhaps moments I had been gently excluded from. I stepped back before they could see me, returned to my room, and closed the door softly behind me. That afternoon, I tried something different. I knocked on Melissa's door. She answered after a moment, her expression slightly surprised. "Hey Mom, can I come in?" I asked. "Yeah, of course." Her room looked the same, clothes folded on the chair, books stacked by the bed, but something felt less lived in, as if she had been spending more time elsewhere. I sat down on the edge of her bed. She leaned against the desk, arms crossed loosely. "How have you been?" I asked. She shrugged lightly. "Good, busy." "Busy with what?" "Just things." I nodded, waited, but she didn't continue. There used to be a time when I didn't have to ask twice, when her words would come freely. Now they stopped just short, as if something held them back. "I made dinner the other night," I said after a pause. "I know," she replied quickly. "I'm sorry we missed it. It's all right." Another pause. "I just thought maybe," I hesitated, "maybe we could have dinner together tonight." She looked at me, not unkindly, but carefully. "I think we already have plans," she said. "With who?" She shifted slightly. "Just with Damien and Genevieve." I let that settle. "With Damien and Genevieve," I repeated softly. She nodded. "It's nothing big, Mom, just something small." I smiled, that same small, careful smile I had been using more often lately. Of course, I stood up. Smoothed the edge of the blanket without thinking. "Well, maybe another time." "Yeah," she said, "another time," but something in her voice told me she didn't quite believe it, and neither did I that evening. I didn't wait, I didn't set the table. I didn't listen from the hallway. Instead, I left the house. Not for any particular reason, just to be somewhere else. Somewhere that didn't feel like it was quietly rearranging itself without me. I walked for a long time. Through streets I had passed 100 times before but never really seen. The air was cooler than I expected. There was a faint smell of something cooking from a nearby restaurant. People moved around me in small groups, talking, laughing, existing in ways that felt both ordinary and distant. At some point, I found myself sitting on a bench, watching the light fade slowly from the sky, and that's when the thought came again, clearer this time, sharper. This wasn't just distance. It wasn't just schedules or misunderstandings. It was intention, not cruel, not loud, but deliberate. And that realization didn't bring anger. It brought something else, a quiet kind of clarity. When I returned home, the house was already settled, lights dimmed, voices low. I slipped off my shoes and walked in slowly. No one noticed, or if they did, they didn't say anything. I paused near the living room. They were all there, sitting close together, Damien on one side of the couch, Melissa beside him, Genevieve in the armchair angled slightly toward them. They were watching something on television, but their attention wasn't fully on the screen, it was on each other. Small comments, shared glances, a rhythm I couldn't quite step into anymore. I stood there for a moment, just watching. And then, without thinking, I spoke. What are you watching? Three heads turned again, that same moment, that same pause. Just a show, Damien said. What show? He hesitated. Something Genevieve recommended. I nodded. Is it good? Melissa shrugged. It's all right. I waited just for a second, but no one said it. No one said, come sit with us. No one made space, so I nodded again. All right, I said softly. And walked past them toward my room. That night I didn't sleep, not really. I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying moments in my mind, not just from the past few days, but from weeks, months, small things, conversations that had shifted, invitations that hadn't come. Decisions that had been made without me, and slowly, piece by piece, a pattern began to form, not a sudden break, but a gradual narrowing, as if the space I once occupied had been slowly reduced, not pushed out, just adjusted, until there was no longer room. The next morning I made a decision, not a dramatic one, not something that would change everything overnight, just something small, something simple. I would ask, not accuse, not confront, just ask. Because whatever this was, whatever had changed between us, I could no longer pretend I didn't see it. And I could no longer carry the question alone. That afternoon I found Damien in the kitchen. He was alone, scrolling through his phone, his expression neutral. I stood in the doorway for a moment, then stepped in. Damien, I said. He looked up. Yeah, Mom, I hesitated. Just for a second, then I asked, did I do something? The question hung there, simple, direct. He blinked. What do you mean? I took a breath. Lately, it feels like I'm not part of things anymore. He frowned slightly. That's not true. Then what is it? He looked away for a moment, then back at me. It's just things are different now. Different how? He hesitated again, and in that hesitation I felt something shift, something real, something he wasn't saying. It's hard to explain, he said finally. Try, I replied gently. Another pause, longer this time. Then he said something that settled deeper than I expected. We just need a little space, Mom. Space, such a small word, such a quiet word, but it carries weight more than people realize. I see, I said. He nodded. It's not about you doing anything wrong. Then what is it about? He exhaled slowly. It's just we're trying to figure things out as a family. I held his gaze. As a family, I repeated, and for the first time I understood, not completely, not fully. But enough to know that whatever family meant now, it didn't include me in the same way anymore. Space. I carried that word with me for the rest of the day, not like a burden, not like something heavy, but like something unfamiliar that I kept turning over in my mind, trying to understand its shape. Space. It sounded reasonable when Damien said it, calm, measured, almost gentle. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized how much it didn't explain. Because space in a home like ours had never meant distance. It had never meant silence. It had never meant closed doors or missed dinners or conversations that stopped when someone entered the room. Space used to mean something else. It meant giving someone time to think, letting them rest, respecting their quiet. But this felt like something different. This felt like being quietly moved aside. That evening I didn't wait for dinner. I didn't listen for footsteps or voices. Instead, I made something small for myself. Soup, simple, warm, enough. I sat at the kitchen table alone and ate slowly, each spoonful measured, each moment deliberate. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something. I just existed in that space. Alone, but aware. And in that awareness, something settled. Not acceptance, not yet, but clarity. The next day, I decided to go through the house, not in a suspicious way, not looking for secrets, just observing, seeing things as they were without the comfort of assumption. I started in the living room. The cushions had been rearranged. Not drastically, but enough that the seat I usually took felt slightly out of place. The small blanket I kept folded over the armrest was gone. I found it later, neatly folded in a basket near Genevieve's chair. Again, not wrong, just different. In the kitchen, I noticed something else. A new set of containers in the cabinet, labeled, organized, meals planned out in advance. I opened the fridge. There were sections now, one shelf clearly used more than the others, grouped items, portioned food, as if routines had shifted without announcement. And then I saw it. A small note attached to the inside of the cabinet door. A weekly schedule, meals, plans, outings, everything written in neat, careful handwriting, Genevieve's handwriting. I stood there reading it. Monday, dinner 6:00 p.m. Tuesday, out 7:00 p.m. Wednesday, light meal 5:30 p.m. Thursday, family time 8:00 p.m. family time. I stared at those words longer than I should have. because I couldn't remember the last time anyone had mentioned it to me. That afternoon, I found Genevieve in the kitchen, alone again. She was cutting vegetables, her movements precise, controlled. There was something steady about her, something that made it difficult to read what she was thinking. "Genevieve," I said softly. She looked up immediately. "Oh, hi," she replied, offering that same composed smile. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course." She set the knife down carefully, wiping her hands on a towel. "What's on your mind?" I stepped closer, not too close, just enough that the conversation felt direct. "I saw the schedule," I said. Her expression didn't change, not visibly. "Ah," she replied. "Yes, I've been trying to organize things a bit better. It helps everyone stay on track." "Everyone," I repeated. She nodded. "It's been working well so far." I let that settle, then I asked the question that had been sitting quietly behind everything else. Why wasn't I included? There it was, simple, clear, no accusation, just truth. Genevieve didn't answer right away. She looked at me, really looked, as if measuring something, choosing something, and then she spoke. "It wasn't intentional," she said, "but it happened." She tilted her head slightly. "You've been less involved lately." I felt that land, softly but firmly. "Less involved," I repeated. She nodded again. "You keep to yourself more. You don't always join us when we're together." I held her gaze. "I didn't know when you were together." A small pause, then she said gently, "We assumed you preferred your own space." There it was again, that word, space. But this time it sounded different, not something they needed, something they believed I wanted. "I never said that," I replied. "No," she said, "but sometimes people don't say things directly." Her tone wasn't unkind. If anything, it was calm, reasonable, and that made it harder to push against. Because there was no obvious fault, no clear line where something had gone wrong, just interpretation, assumption, and a slow shift built on both. "I didn't realize that's how it looked," I said quietly. She nodded. "I understand." Another pause, then after a moment she added, "If you want to join us more you can, not we want you to, not we missed you, just can, an option. An opening but not an invitation." "I see," I said, and for the first time I truly did. That evening I didn't stay in my room, I didn't wait to be called. At exactly 6 o'clock I walked into the dining room. The table was already set, 3 plates. 3 glasses, 3 seats filled. They looked up as I entered, that same moment. That same pause, but this time I didn't stop. I walked to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. No one spoke for a second, then Damien cleared his throat. "Mom, we didn't know you were joining." "I didn't know I needed to tell you," I replied calmly. Another pause. Melissa shifted slightly. Genevieve adjusted her posture, but no one asked me to leave. No one moved to stop me, so I stayed. Dinner continued. Conversation resumed. But something was different, not tense, not uncomfortable, just careful, words chosen more deliberately. Silences held a little longer, as if everyone was aware of something unspoken sitting at the table with us. At one point, Damien said something to Genevieve and they both smiled. Melissa added something after and they laughed. I listened, watched, and then without thinking I spoke. "I remember when Damien used to hate green beans," I said lightly. Damien looked at me, then at his plate, then back at me. "That was a long time ago," he said. I nodded. It was. No one added to it. No one continued the memory. The conversation shifted again, moved around me, not against me, just around. And in that moment I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't about being pushed out, not entirely. It was about being replaced. Not in a cruel way, not intentionally, but naturally, gradually. The roles had changed, the center had shifted, and I was still sitting in a place that no longer belonged to me. After dinner, I helped clear the table. No one asked me to. But no one stopped me either. It felt neutral, balanced, and yet beneath it something remained unsettled, because presence is not the same as belonging. And that night, sitting at that table, I had been present, but I had not belonged. Later, as I stood in the kitchen alone, rinsing the last plate, I realized something else, something quieter, but just as important. They hadn't meant to hurt me, not in the way I had first imagined. There had been no plan, no decision made in secret. Just a slow movement forward, and I had stayed still, assuming I was still part of it. I dried my hands, turned off the light, and stood there for a moment in the darkened kitchen, not lost, not broken, just aware. And that awareness brought a different kind of question. Not why did they do this, but something else, something more difficult. Where do I stand now? That question didn't leave me. It followed me into the next morning, into the quiet rhythm of the house. into the spaces that once felt certain and now felt negotiable. Where do I stand now? It wasn't a question of anger, not anymore. It was something steadier, something that required honesty, not just about them, but about myself. For years, I had been the center of that house. Not in a loud way, not in a controlling way, but in the quiet ways that hold things together. I was the one who remembered what everyone liked to eat, the one who noticed when someone had a long day, the one who kept track of small details no one else paid attention to. I didn't ask for that role, it just became mine, and I carried it without thinking, without questioning, because it felt natural, because it felt like love. But somewhere along the way, that role had shifted. Not taken, not forced away, just outgrown, and I hadn't noticed, or maybe I had, but I hadn't wanted to see it. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I left the house with a purpose, not to escape, not to avoid, but to remember something I had quietly set aside. I walked to the small bookstore a few streets away, the one I used to visit years ago before life became centered around everyone else. It hadn't changed much, the same wooden shelves, the same faint smell of paper and dust, the same soft music playing somewhere in the background. I stepped inside slowly, as if entering a place that had been waiting for me. The owner looked up and smiled. I recognized him immediately. "Been a while," he said gently. "It has," I replied, no questions, no explanations, just acknowledgement. I wandered through the aisles, letting my fingers brush against the spines of books I hadn't thought about in years, stories I used to lose myself in, ideas that once felt important. I picked one up, then another. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something shift, not in my home, not in my family, but in me. When I returned that evening, the house felt the same, familiar, unchanged. And yet I walked through it differently. Not as someone waiting to be included, but as someone simply present. Damien was in the living room, Melissa beside him, Genevieve in her usual chair. They looked up as I entered. "Hey," Damien said. "Hi," I replied. I didn't stop, I didn't wait. I went to the kitchen, placed my bag on the counter, and began preparing something small for myself. A simple meal, enough. A few minutes later, Melissa appeared in the doorway. "What are you making?" she asked. "Just something light," I said. She nodded, then lingered. For a moment I thought she might say something more, but she didn't. She just stood there, watching. "Do you want some?" I asked. The question came naturally, the way it always had. She hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I'm okay. All right." She stayed a moment longer, then turned and walked back to the living room. And that was it. No tension, no discomfort, just distance, clear, defined, and strangely easier to accept. Over the next few days, I stopped trying to return things to the way they were. I stopped setting the table for everyone, stopped waiting for shared meals, stopped listening for laughter that might or might not include me. Instead, I created my own rhythm. I ate when I was hungry, went out when I wanted, spent time in places that felt open. And something interesting happened. The house didn't resist it. In fact, it seemed to settle more naturally, as if the quiet tension that had been building had finally found a shape it could rest in. One evening, about a week later, something unexpected happened. I was sitting in the living room reading, not waiting, not watching, just reading, when Damien walked in, alone. He paused when he saw me. "Hey," he said. "Hey." He stood there for a moment, then sat down across from me, not beside me, across, a small detail, but one I noticed. "How have you been?" he asked. I looked up from my book. "Good," I said. "Busy?" He smiled slightly. "Busy with what?" "Just things." For a moment, neither of us spoke, then he exhaled. "I didn't mean for things to feel off," he said. "I know," I replied. He looked at me, surprised. "Maybe you do?" I nodded. "I do." Another pause, then he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "It's just things have been changing," he said. "I've noticed. It's not that we don't want you around," he added quickly. "I didn't think that." He hesitated, then asked quietly, "Then what do you think?" I considered that carefully. "I think you've built something new," I said. And I didn't realize I wasn't in the center of it anymore. He sat back. "Let that settle. That doesn't mean you're not important," he said. "I know," I replied, and I did. That was the part that had taken time to understand. This wasn't about being unloved. It was about being repositioned, and those two things are not the same. A few days later, the shift became visible, not just to me, but to everyone. It happened during dinner, not planned, not announced, just happened. I was already in the kitchen when they came in. I had cooked something simple, enough for one, maybe two, but not four. Damien looked at the stove, then at me. You didn't make enough for everyone? He asked. No, I said calmly. A small pause followed. Then Melissa spoke. We thought we'd eat together tonight. I looked at her gently. I didn't know that. Another pause. Genevieve stepped forward slightly. We can still... It's all right, I said, not cold, not defensive, just clear. You should eat. They stood there for a moment, uncertain, and for the first time I saw it, not confusion. Not frustration, but awareness. The same awareness I had come to days before. They were feeling it now too, the shift, the space, the change, and for a brief moment we all stood in it together, without pretending it wasn't there. That night no one closed the dining room door, no one lowered their voices, no one tried to hide the space between us. And somehow that made it easier, because silence is harder when it's hidden, but when it's acknowledged it becomes something else, something you can move through. Later, as I sat in my room, I realized something important. I had spent so much time trying to understand what I had lost that I hadn't fully seen what I still had. A home, a family, not the same as before, but still real, still present. Still mine in a different way, and maybe that was enough. But there was still one thing left. One conversation that hadn't happened, not with Damien, not with Melissa, but with Genevieve, because somewhere in all of this she had become part of the center. And I had never truly understood how, or why. It was a quiet afternoon when I finally spoke to Genevieve, not planned, not rehearsed, just timely. The house was still. Damien had gone out to run errands, Melissa was at work. And for once there were no overlapping sounds filling the space between rooms. I found Genevieve in the kitchen. Of course it was the kitchen, it always seemed to come back to that room. She was standing by the counter arranging something into containers, neatly, methodically. The same way she always did, there was a calm to her movements, a control not rigid but intentional. Genevieve, I said softly. She turned almost immediately. Oh hi, she replied, that familiar, composed expression settling into place. Do you have a moment? She nodded, of course. She set the container down and wiped her hands, giving me her full attention. That was something about her I had always noticed. When she chose to listen, she listened completely. No distractions, no half focus, just presence. I stepped a little closer, not too close, but enough that the conversation felt honest. I've been thinking, I said. She waited, not interrupting, not rushing me, and for a moment I appreciated that, because some people fill silence too quickly, but Genevieve didn't. She let it exist. I think I misunderstood a lot of things, I continued. Her eyes softened slightly. How so? I took a breath. I thought something was being taken from me, I said, but now I think something new was being built and I just didn't see where I fit into it. She didn't answer right away. She considered it, carefully. Then she nodded. That's not entirely wrong. There was no defensiveness in her voice, no denial, just honesty. And you? I asked gently. Where did you see me in all of that? Another pause, but this one felt different, not uncertain, just thoughtful. I saw you as someone who had already given so much, she said. I blinked slightly, not expecting that. She continued. You created the structure of this home, the habits, the way things functioned. That didn't go unnoticed. I held her gaze. Then why did it feel like I was being left out of it? She exhaled slowly. Because we didn't know how to include you without disrupting what we were trying to build. That landed deeper than I expected. Disrupting, I repeated. She nodded. Not in a negative way, she added quickly, but you have a strong presence, a way of holding things together. And sometimes, when people are trying to find their own rhythm, they step away from what's already established. I let that settle because there was truth in it. Not easy truth, but truth. You could have told me, I said quietly. Yes, she replied. We could have. No excuse, no justification, just acknowledgement. And I could have asked sooner, I added. She gave a small, understanding nod. Yes. For a moment we stood there in a kind of balance, not opposing each other, not defending positions, just recognizing what had happened, without needing to assign blame. I never wanted you to feel excluded, she said after a moment. I know, I replied, and I meant it. Because intention matters, even when the outcome doesn't match it. We stood there for a while longer, not speaking, but not uncomfortable either, just present. Then she did something unexpected. Would you like to help me with this? She asked, gesturing toward the containers. I looked at them. Then at her. Sure, I said, and just like that something shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. We worked side by side in silence at first, cutting, sorting, arranging, simple tasks, familiar in a way that didn't feel forced. After a few minutes, she spoke again. "You know," she said, "Melissa really values your opinion." I glanced at her. "She doesn't show it much lately." Genevieve smiled slightly. "She doesn't always know how to show things directly." That sounded familiar. "Damien too," she added. "He just expresses it differently now." I nodded. "I've noticed." Another pause, then I asked something I hadn't realized I needed to. "Did I make it difficult?" Genevieve looked at me, not surprised, just thoughtful. "Sometimes," she said gently. I waited. "You were always the one who knew what was best," she continued. "And for a long time, that was exactly what everyone needed." I understood that, I had lived that. "But then things changed," she said, "and I think we didn't know how to adjust that dynamic without creating distance." "And distance was easier," I said. She nodded. "Yes." That word again, easy. Sometimes people choose what's easier in the moment without realizing what it costs later. By the time we finished, the kitchen looked the same as it always did, clean, organized, quiet, but something beneath it had shifted, not fixed, not resolved completely, but understood. And understanding has a way of softening things that once felt sharp. That evening, something subtle changed, not in a way that anyone announced, but in the way people moved, the way they spoke. Dinner was still at 6, still planned, still structured. But when I walked into the dining room, no one paused this time, no one hesitated. Damien looked up and said simply, "Hey, Mom." Melissa smiled. Genevieve nodded toward the table. There was a chair, not newly added, not specially placed, just there, available. I sat down. And this time, it felt different, not because everything was back to how it used to be, but because I wasn't trying to return to that place anymore. I was sitting in a new one, and for the first time, I didn't resist it. Conversation moved naturally, not perfectly. Not seamlessly, but without that careful tension that had been there before. At one point, Melissa mentioned something from work. I listened, then responded. She nodded, engaged, present. It wasn't the same as before, but it wasn't distant either. It was something in between, something that had room to grow. After dinner, as I stood by the sink rinsing a plate, Damien came up beside me. "You okay?" he asked. I glanced at him. "Yes," I said. "I think I am." He nodded, and for a moment, neither of us said anything else. But we didn't need to, because sometimes understanding doesn't need to be spoken again once it's been found. Later that night, I sat by the window again, the same place I had sat before, but I wasn't listening to the house in the same way. I wasn't measuring silence. I wasn't counting moments. I was just there, and I realized something. Nothing had been taken from me, not really. It had just changed shape. And I had been holding onto the old shape so tightly that I couldn't see the new one forming. I looked out into the quiet street, the soft glow of lights, the stillness of the night. And for the first time since that evening in the hallway, I didn't feel like I was standing outside something. I felt like I was standing within it, just in a different place.